There's a misconception today that flow is rare, that it belongs to artists in perfect conditions, athletes in peak performance, or moments where everything just happens to align. But when you look closer, especially through the lens of the body and the brain, it becomes clear that flow is far less mysterious and far more trainable than most people are willing to consider. Flow is not an accident of circumstance. It is the result of internal conditions being met with enough consistency that the mind and body stop competing with each other. And when that state begins to overlap with what genuinely matters to you, what the Japanese philosophy of ikigai points toward as your reason for being, something shifts. You're no longer just performing well. You're participating in something that feels inherently meaningful. Before there is meaning, there is regulation. Most people try to access purpose cognitively. They think about it, journal it, analyze it, attempt to define it into existence. But purpose is incredibly difficult to access from a dysregulated system. If the nervous system is in a constant state of urgency, distraction, or low-grade stress, the mind doesn't expand into clarity. It contracts into survival patterns. In that state, everything feels either overwhelming or underwhelming. Nothing feels precise. This is where the body becomes the entry point. Breath is one of the most immediate ways to influence the nervous system. Slow, intentional breathing begins to stabilize internal rhythms. It signals safety. It creates space between impulse and action. Movement deepens the process, not movement as punishment or output, but movement as communication with the body. Rhythmic, intentional movement patterns begin to organize internal chaos. The mind follows the body's lead. Attention sharpens, but it softens at the same time. You're focused, but not rigid. Aware, but not overthinking. Neuroscience often describes this as a shift in brainwave patterns and a temporary quieting of the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for self-criticism and overanalysis. When that quiets, other networks communicate more fluidly. Creativity increases. Problem-solving becomes less forced. Time perception changes. This is the doorway into flow, and it does not open through force. It opens through coherence. Flow lives at the edge, not in extremes. There is a very specific threshold where flow becomes accessible. It is not when something is easy, and it is not when something is overwhelming. It's when challenge and skill meet in a way that demands your full attention, but does not exceed your capacity to respond. This is why flow feels so immersive. It requires you fully, not fragmented across distractions, not pulled in multiple directions, but engaged in a way that integrates your physical body, cognitive, and emotional systems. And over time, this becomes incredibly informative, because the activities that consistently bring you into flow are not random. They are data points. They show you where your natural inclinations, your trained abilities, and your internal resonance intersect. This is where ikigai stops being philosophical and starts becoming experiential. You begin to recognize that purpose is less about choosing a path and more about noticing where you come alive repeatedly, under conditions that require both your discipline and your presence. You don't chase flow, you reduce resistance to it. One of the more subtle but important shifts is understanding that flow is not something you pursue directly. The more you chase it, the more elusive it tends to become. Instead, you build the conditions that make it more likely. This is where daily practices matter, not in a rigid or performative way, but in a foundational one. When your body is consistently moved in a way that maintains mobility and circulation, it becomes more responsive. When your breath is trained, even in small doses, it becomes an anchor rather than an afterthought. When you engage in some form of creative expression without immediate judgment or outcome pressure, you keep the channels of exploration open. Over time, these inputs recalibrate your baseline. You begin to notice that it takes less effort to enter focused states, less friction to begin, less internal negotiation to stay engaged. Discipline in this context is not about forcing yourself into action. It is about removing the barriers that make aligned action feel difficult. Ease is a function of alignment, not simplicity. There's a tendency to associate ease with lack of effort, but that's not what flow demonstrates. In a true flow state, you can be physically exerting, mentally challenged, and deeply focused, and still experience a sense of smoothness. That smoothness is not because the task is simple. It's because there is no internal conflict about doing it. Your attention is not divided. Your body is not resisting. Your mind is not questioning every step. Everything is moving in the same direction. This is what creates the felt sense of ease. And when that state is connected to something that matters to you, something that reflects your values, your curiosity, your way of contributing, it begins to resemble purpose in motion, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived experience. Ikigai as a lived rhythm rather than a concept. Ikigai is often presented as a diagram, something to figure out, define, or arrive at. But in practice, it behaves more like a rhythm than a destination. It reveals itself through repetition, through patterns of engagement, through noticing where effort feels generative rather than depleting. Flow accelerates this recognition, because when you are in flow, you are not negotiating with yourself. You are not questioning whether you should be doing what you're doing. You are simply inside it. And that removes a layer of noise that often distorts our perception of meaning. Over time, as you stack more of these experiences, a clearer picture forms. Not all at once, but gradually, quietly. You begin to trust what draws you in. You begin to refine where you place your energy. You begin to recognize that meaning is not something you attach to your life after the fact. It is something that emerges from the way you engage with it. Training for flow is training for a different way of living. When you start to orient your life around accessing and sustaining flow, even in small ways, things reorganize. Your relationship to time shifts. You become less concerned with constant productivity and more focused on depth of engagement. Your tolerance for distraction decreases, not through force, but because it becomes less appealing. You recover differently. You move differently. You think differently. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to experience a sense of continuity between who you are and what you do. There is less fragmentation. Flow in this sense is not just a performance state. It is a way of being that reflects internal alignment. And Ikigai is not something waiting for you at the end of a long search. It is something that becomes visible as you train your system to move, breathe, create, and focus in ways that allow you to access it. Not occasionally, but as a rhythm you return to again and again until it starts to feel like home.